Yes, welcome here. What a crazy week, right? We live in interesting times. And I think for many of us, we don't know what the futures hold, and for many of us, things just seem so unclear, and a little bit chaotic maybe. And I think it's all the more important to have places like this where we can come together and find support and find love and encouragement, because I believe whatever's happening in the future, whatever's happening now, demands that we have both a bent towards prayer and contemplation and a bent towards action in the world. And that when we act out of a place of love and centeredness, we extend our heart, our hands to other people in a way that doesn't continue violence in our world. Does that make sense? And so that's what I hope that we're able to do here as a community, that we're able to grow in love, and we reach out from a place of love. Instead of reacting, we respond to that place. So whatever the future is, if you're here today and I'm confused, I'm uncertain, I don't know what's going to happen, just know there's many people. I think we're all in that boat. We don't know, and yet we place our trust, which is really what faith means, in something beyond ourselves, and we partner together to work towards that. So for most of you here, you know that we've been going through a series called Reframing Christianity. So we've been talking about how we can look at Christianity in a new or different way, which is what reframe means. And so today we have a guest speaker who has graciously joined us here today. And I'm going to introduce him really quickly, and he's going to get up here and take the mic from me. Brian McLaren, he was a pastor for 24 years. He is a public theologian. He's an activist. He's an author of many different books. His most recent book, A Great Spiritual Migration, is a book we're going to be doing through some of our small groups here. How to look at Christianity in a new way, and where is that leading us forward? So many of us, I think, are struggling with that question, and how to be a Christian in today's world. But through all of this, well, let me say he's been a huge mentor of mine, and so he's influenced one church in ways probably we don't know or we don't always see. But some of his books, A Generous Orthodoxy and A New Kind of Christianity, helped me at very pivotal times in my life and my faith struggle, and how to think things differently or new. And so this morning as he comes up, I think all of his work and what he's doing is leading us forward and helping us all create a more just and generous world where we can all work together. Doesn't matter our doctrines or beliefs or even our religion, but we can work together across these boundaries for the common good of all people. And so today, I hope your hearts will be touched. And I think today it's going to be a wonderful time, especially timely in light of everything else that's happening in our world today. Would you give Brian McLaren a warm One Church welcome?
I'm so happy to be here. I should say, when I was a pastor, we met in rented facilities for 19 years. And so when I saw a truck pull up and all the setup going on, it brought back memories. And I never knew there was such a thing as a trampoline park. Like, this is a new deal. And a church and a trampoline park, like, you know, it's a good new meaning to the word holy rollers and stuff like that. You could have all kinds of fun with that. But my wife's name is Grace. We got married in 1979. And when we got back from our honeymoon, well, I should say, while we were away on our honeymoon, the apartment we were going to move into came open. And this tells you what a nice brother I have. My brother organized moving all of our furniture into the new apartment while we were away on our honeymoon. That's nice, right? So we get back to the airport late at night and get a cab back to this apartment where we've never been, we've never stayed, and all our furniture's set up. Literally, you know, the dressers are in there, and it's just really, really nice. And this just tells you what a great guy my brother is. But he is my brother, and you know how brothers are. So I remember being in the taxi thinking, I I've really got to go to the bathroom. And we get to the place, and I'm opening the key in the door and trying to get in really fast. It had been a long flight, right? And so I try to open the bathroom door in this new apartment I've never been in, but never stayed in before. And the door, the handle turns, but when I push it, it pushes back. And I realized that as a sort of welcome home gift, my brother has blown up hundreds of balloons and filled up the entire bathroom, like to the top. Like at the end, he was having to crack the door open and squeeze balloons in. And now at this moment, anyway, let's just say I very quickly was pulling up balloons. And my first thought is, I just want to pop all these balloons, but by now it's 12:30 at night or in the morning. And, what are my new neighbors going to think? Oh, that new couple is having a gunfight, on their first night back. So we're pulling out balloons, and literally it's like this slow tidal wave of balloons spreads out from the hallway down this other little hallway, fills our little living room in our little tiny apartment. And it's this, red and blue and pink and yellow and white balloons just spread across the floor. And anyway, didn't do anything about it that night. Next morning, I woke up, and I'm in my new apartment. I don't know how this happens in marriages. I'm a morning person. My wife is a night person, right? So I was up early, and I'm sitting out on the front stoop of this new apartment, kind of waiting for her to wake up. And it was August, and I had a pair of jeans on. I was barefoot. I had a T-shirt. So I'm just sort of sitting out on the front porch, and this little guy, 7 years old, comes bounding down the stairs. I hear his feet on the stairs, swings open the door, runs right by me, and he turns around and says, "Oh, you're the new guy." I said, "Yeah, my name's Brian. What's your name?" "I'm Armin," he says, and he just takes off and disappears. So I sit there a few more minutes, and whatever his business was, he comes back, and as he's coming up the stairs, we start talking, and this inspiration comes into my mind. I said, "Armin, do you like balloons?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Come here, I want to show you something." Now, I should tell you, from that moment on, Armin felt comfortable in my apartment. Like, my wife, we're newlyweds. I had to continually lock the door because you never knew when you'd look up and Armin would be in there. He felt very much at home. But Armin came in, and he looks at these balloons, and his eyes get big, and he says, "Hey, Brian, I can help you." And he runs out the door. And within about 15 minutes, he comes back with a line of about a dozen kids, from 7 or 8 down to 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds. And they all come walking out with the balloons. And after literally 4 or 5 trips, my apartment was empty. And I had a new friend for life. And Armin was my first Muslim friend. Now, I need to tell you, I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian setting. Today, they call them evangelicals, but sometimes I just think evangelicals are often fundamentalists who like rock and roll. But even fundamentalists like rock and roll now. But I was taught, to have a very skeptical attitude toward people of other religions. So all of my religious upbringing would have made me nervous about Armin and only see him either as somebody I need to convert to my religion or somebody to be afraid of. But due to the circumstances of our friendship, I was sort of indebted to Armin from that point on. A few months later, my wife and I were sitting in our little apartment, and we hear the sound of water falling, and it was not a normal sound. And I went into the kitchen, and we had this a globe light, like it was a glass globe with a light bulb in it, right? And I go in, and I see that the globe is filling up with water, and water is dripping around the edge of this light fixture, and I notice that water is coming from a few other places in the ceiling, and I'm thinking, this is a problem. So I run upstairs. It was Armin's apartment directly above us. And I go knocking on the door. I'd never met Armin's mother. But this lady comes to the door, and I introduce myself, and I say, "We have water flowing down." I'm thinking, they must have a pipe that's broken in her apartment that's coming down from her kitchen to my kitchen. And I come in, and Parveen, it looks like she's crying. And that night I learned her story. She and Armin had been in Iran. Her husband had become a graduate student at the university where I was a graduate student. And when he came and spent 1 year there and then brought her and their son over, when she arrived, she found out that during that year, he had found a young American graduate student as his new girlfriend and expected her to put up with this. And when she refused to put up with it and kicked him out, she's now a single mom, an immigrant in a new country, speaking hardly any English, having a job on the back line of a McDonald's, if you know what that means, and trying to survive with her son who'd mastered English really fast and was basically the ruler of the neighborhood, you know. Thank God for him, because he sort of kept her going. But she's crying, she's upset. And then she, in her broken English, explains to me that there were so many roaches, and our apartment had terrible problem with roaches, so many roaches, that she finally got so disgusted, she had big pots full of boiling water, and she was pouring boiling water trying to kill the roaches. And I had to explain to her, Parveen, please don't do this. It's a little bit dangerous, you know, and it's a problem. So that was how we met. And it so happens that 1979, 1980, you might remember, there was something going on in American politics. It was called the Iran hostage situation. And there were a group of American hostages held by the Iranian government, and it was a very tense time between the U.S. and Iran. It was actually quite a turbulent turnover from one presidential administration to the next. We won't even go into that. But when Parveen found out that this American couple underneath her liked her and was nice to her as an Iranian, she sent word to all of her Iranian friends, I found some Americans who don't hate us. And from that moment on, Grace and I were invited to all these Iranian parties. Like, I never knew how good Iranian food was, but I became a total fan. And we were in Parveen's home, and she was in our home, and we had holidays together, not to mention all the times I forgot to lock the door, and Armin would sneak in, and, you know, all that stuff. But our families became intertwined. Now, here's the thing I'm wondering about this morning. Why wasn't there a wall between us? Why wasn't there a barrier between us? Why didn't my religion that I was brought up with keep me away from Armin and Parveen, who became dear friends and important people in my life? How did that happen? Why did that happen? And as I was thinking about that, about coming this week and being with you all this week, I can only account for it in one way. And that was that when I was a teenager, I was on my way out of the church. I liked science, and I liked rock and roll, and I liked a lot of things that disqualify. I thought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great guy and all that sort of thing. There were a lot of things that put me out of sync with my religious community. And I was on my way out, but I was invited on this retreat where I had this very powerful spiritual experience, and I started meeting other people who were Christians in a different way than the people I grew up with. Maybe the way a lot of you feel about one church. It's like, wow, these are Christians, but they're playing by a different set of rules, you know. And I remember on this retreat that I was invited to, I don't even remember who the speaker of the retreat was, but I remember he had this suggestion. He said, my suggestion is you find 1 or 2 chapters of the Bible and read the same chapters every day, and don't move on to another chapter until you feel like you've really learned that chapter and you're living it out in your life. Well, I was kind of new to actually reading the Bible on my own, so this seemed like a pretty manageable technique. And for all of my junior and all of my senior year of high school, and then into the beginning of my college years, I had 2 chapters, and I never graduated from those 2. One was 1 Corinthians 13, which everybody knows as the wedding chapter, right? But it wasn't really written for weddings. It was written for life. It's a chapter about love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Now, love is not jealous. Love is not envious. If you've only ever read that in a or heard that in a wedding, you might try it. You might try reading 1 Corinthians 13 every morning while you have your coffee or something. I highly recommend it. If it gets in your brain, in your heart, it makes a big difference. The other chapter I read, I don't know how I found this one, but it was from the book of Romans, chapter 12, and I'd like to read it to you right now. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your proper worship. You get that? Give yourself, your body and everything it contains. The sacrifice or the offering God is looking for is not for you to kill some animal. It doesn't need to be appeased with blood. But rather, God wants your life, you alive, to be given to God. Then do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. You know, it's interesting. If that verse had been read in my religious upbringing, do not conform to this world would have meant don't wear blue jeans. Back in my day, it would have read, don't grow your hair long. Now, look, I should just say, as someone who's follicularly challenged, you know, I grew my hair long, right, back in those days. One of my friends said, yeah, you used it up all at once. You use your lifetime supply, you know, all at once. And my current belief is if you can grow hair, do whatever you want with it. But it would have been very superficial things. Follow me on this. Do not be conformed to this world would have been don't drink alcohol, don't wear certain clothes, don't listen to certain kinds of music. It said nothing about whether or not you were a racist. It said nothing about whether or not you cared for the poor and the widow and the orphan and the immigrant and the outsider. It only had to do with certain outward markers, but it didn't deal with these deeper issues of conformity for me as a white guy. And somehow I think those mornings when before school I read Romans 12 and it said, do not be conformed to the world. Because I read this whole chapter, I started to get an idea of what conformity to the world was about. Listen, because I think what happens, he says, don't be conformed to this world. And then everything that follows is an explanation. Here's how you're supposed to be different. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Just as each of us has one body with many members, these members do not have the same function. So in Christ, we, though we are many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. Don't be conformed to this world. In this world, they tell you if someone is different, they're dangerous. And the only way they can be safe is if they're the same. Don't be conformed to this world. Understand, different is an asset, not a danger. If someone's different, they have gifts that are different than yours. They have something to offer you. You have something to offer them. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. And then he talks about that a little bit more. Then he says, love must be sincere. Don't be conformed to this world. This world is full of fake love. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal. Keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of a low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay evil for evil for anyone. Be careful to do what is right in the sight of everyone. Be at peace with everyone. Don't get revenge. Leave revenge to God. And then he ends it up by saying, don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good, which is another way of saying, don't be conformed to the hateful, destructive patterns of this world, but be transformed. Do you see the pattern? Conformed, transformed. Overcome with evil, overcoming evil with good. Now, brothers and sisters, look, I'm sure we have people who were Democrats and Republicans and independents and all that stuff in this last election. But however you voted, right now we're talking Christianity. We're not talking partisan politics, right? This thing about letting love be sincere and not being conformed to the pattern of this world matters a whole lot right now. Because in our culture, we've got something going on. It's happened many times before in the past. If you are a student of history, you know it's happened. It's happened in American history. It's happened in many other cultures too. All through the Middle Ages, a lot of people don't know this, but the Christians of Europe periodically were whipped into a frenzy by unscrupulous leaders to say, the Jews are out to get us all. And do you understand? They would whip Christians into a frenzy to go and burn down the houses of Jews, kill Jews, drive Jews homeless from their town. And of course, it was all lies. It was all misinformation. But there's a long history of Christian prejudice against Jews, culminating in what we just had the Holocaust Remembrance Day this week, culminating in this absurd and atrocious travesty of the Holocaust. I mean, but that didn't just happen in the 1930s. It had a long history that went behind it. The term for it is scapegoating. When a group of people have trouble in their group and they have a lot of anxiety and they're turning on each other, a great way to deal with it, I use great in quotes, is to find some group that you can project all of your anxieties on and blame them for everything. And so it was the Jews for a long time. Guess what? After Catholics and Protestants split, Catholics and Protestants did it to each other. Whoever was in the minority was in danger of being scapegoated by the majority. Let me tell you something. Through a long period in medieval European history, it was women who didn't fit a certain norm. And so they would be called witches, and all kinds of horrible things were done to women. And it was a way of the majority taking their anxieties and venting it on someone who had no power of revenge. It was a very safe way to unify everybody against a common enemy. Did you know in American history, the Irish were one of the first people scapegoated. When Irish people came in, they were treated as a danger and a threat, partly because they were Catholic, partly because there was long-standing prejudices against the Irish in what we now call the United Kingdom. Italians. It's not that long ago. Italians were the big threat. It's sort of, to me, it's sort of strange and sad to watch the grandchildren of the Irish and the Italians who were abused by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants now sort of join as white people and abuse the next group of people who come along, right? But it's a pattern in American history. Don't be conformed to that pattern, Romans 12 says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, a new way to think about people, a new way to think about human beings, a new way to think about the other. And my gosh, I think a lot of us are looking around thinking we don't know what's going to happen. And I'm heartbroken to say this, but around the country today, there are thousands and thousands of churches that will go through the motions and sing the songs and do the rituals and pray the prayers, and they will pretend like these realities aren't out there. And as long as people put money in the offering box and come back next week, they won't care whether they're conformed to this world. But we need churches like One Church to say, listen, folks, lives are at stake out there. And we've got to form a community where people are not conformed to these very human patterns, but rather are transformed by the renewing of our minds so that we don't see differentness only as danger. We learn to see it as gift, so that we aren't just loving in superficiality, but our love is sincere, that we learn to have empathy. We weep with those who weep. We rejoice with those who rejoice. And we learn to not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Does that make sense? So fast forward some years. Grace and I moved away, and we actually lost touch with Parveen and Amir, and I became a pastor. At that point, I was an English professor. I became a pastor, and September 11th happened. And the day after September 11th, our church had a prayer service, and we were in this prayer service. There was a Seventh-day Adventist church that rented space from us, so we did a joint prayer service on September 12th, 2001, and we broke people into small groups, and we had prayers going on. And I'll never forget that night, because the Seventh-day Adventist church that rented from us was very conservative and very traditional theologically, very racially diverse, but maybe you might say culturally and theologically, pretty strict. And our congregation, we had people from all over the map, right? And so it just so happened that in this group was my wife and I and two members of our congregation, and then 3 or 4 elderly members of the Seventh-day Adventist congregation who all happened to be widows. And the 2 members of my congregation happened to be a lesbian couple. So I'm thinking, if these ladies knew about these ladies, this would not go well, right? But there we were that night, and there were tears, and we were praying for our country, we were praying for safety, and we were feeling the presence of the Spirit as we prayed together on that night. And I had something weird happen. It felt like a flick in the head from the Holy Spirit. I literally, I'm not one of these people who says, oh, God told me this, God told me that, but I felt like, here's the sentence that came up with me. Your Muslim neighbors are in danger. And I had this feeling like that as a Christian, God was calling me to do something. So the next morning I got up and I wrote a letter because there were 4 mosques and a community center, Muslim community center, within a short drive from my church. And so I wrote this letter. Dear Muslim neighbors, I'm the pastor of this church. We hope there won't be any trouble, but if there is, this is my personal phone number, here's my email address, and I can speak on behalf of my church to say, if there's any trouble, we'll be there for you. And so I went to the first mosque, and it was locked up tight, and I stuck my envelope in the mailbox. And I went to the second mosque, same thing, went to the community center. When I got to the last mosque, this mosque had a big chain link fence around it, and it had electric gates, like this, those automatic gates that open. And when I pulled up, the gates were opening, and a big television truck, those television vans with a satellite dish on the top, was pulling out. And I learned later that a Muslim woman from that mosque had been walking down the sidewalk in Washington, D.C., and she was covered, and this big white guy came, shoved her down on the ground. She falls back on the sidewalk, bangs right on the sidewalk. He bends over and says, I bet you're glad this happened. Why don't you go back where you came from? So the TV crew was there to interview the imam about this and so on. I didn't know that. I just see the van pulling out. Now, this is stupid. This is not my smartest moment in my life, right? But I see the gates now. The van comes out, the gates are closing, and I want to get to talk to this guy. So I step on it and speed through the gates before they close. Now, I need to tell you, I drive a Prius, so I didn't burn rubber, right? But I come in, and the imam, who's this, pretty short Pakistani fellow, comes running out like this, telling me to stop. And he's nervous, like, am I a terrorist coming, And so I slammed on my brakes, which didn't help things, and got out of the car, and I said, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to alarm you. I said, I'm the pastor from up the road. I actually came to give you this letter. And before I could say anything, he took the letter, he opened it, And I'll never forget because, I'm not that tall, but he's a small guy. He reads a letter. He looks up at me, reads a letter, looks up at me, reads a letter, throws his arms around me, just pulls me in, And I remember the feeling of his head against my chest right here. And we're standing in the parking lot, my Prius is running, and we're just holding each other. It's two human beings who know that these are dangerous times. But gosh, we need some people to say we're going to love each other. He said, thank you for coming. He said, no one else has come. We feel so afraid. We feel so alone. The TV truck was here because a woman in my mosque was assaulted on the street today. We're so afraid. Please come in my office. I'm not proud of this, it's the truth. How old was I? I was 55 years old. I had never been in a mosque before in my life. And he said, please come into my office. I'd never been in an imam's office before. I found out it was just like a pastor's office, except in his case, much cleaner, and all the books were in Arabic. We had a cup of tea. His assistant made us a cup of tea. And a friendship began that day. And so many stories I could tell you about what happened because of that. But I remember the mosque invited our congregation to come for a meal. And for a lot of the Christians in my church, this is pretty scary. They'd never been in a mosque either. And and the news, cable news, was telling them that all Muslims are terrorists and all Muslims are dangerous. And some of them were really nervous, but because I guess they trusted me as their pastor, a lot of them came. And guess what? They found out that Pakistani food was just as good as Iranian food, and we had some great meals together at their mosque, and we were welcomed and warmly welcomed and treated with such great respect as neighbors. Imam Shamshad, he wasn't a phone guy, and he certainly wasn't an email guy. He was from the old country and had the old ways. So if he wanted to see me, he'd come over to the church. And Sunday was his day off. So when he wanted to see me, he always knew where he could find me on a Sunday. And I remember the first time this happened, I was like sitting right where Aaron is, and somebody comes up during the service. We were having communion, so I wasn't leading at that point. I was just sitting there. Somebody comes up and whispers in my ear, "Hey, Brian, your imam is here and looking for you." Which was funny on a lot of levels. And what at first freaked people out to see this guy in Pakistani dress who they knew was an imam, it freaked them out at first. But you know what? After a while, he was a friend. He was welcome. We made space for each other. We stopped being conformed to this world with its prejudices and bigotry and false ideas and propaganda, and we were transformed by the renewing of our minds. My goodness sakes, brothers and sisters. We need congregations that help people be transformed in this way right now. Because our world is in trouble. We need it in Rwanda and Burundi, where the Hutu and the Tutsi and the Twa have to learn how to get together and live together. We need it in Kenya, where a much larger number of tribes have to learn how to live together. And if people maintain their tribal prejudices, violence breaks out, and it's like a wildfire. We need it in Europe, where everybody's upset about immigrants and where people are wanting to divide from each other and all the rest. We need it there. Don't you think we need it in America, where we're torn apart in 100 different ways? Brothers and sisters, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds. Let love be without hypocrisy. Don't be overcome with evil. Overcome evil with good. Amen? Let's pray together.